In the front row, Crespo-Cuaresma, Elisabeth Götze, Anke Schaffartzik, Logan Strenchock, and Colleen Schneider. We will do a quick round of introductions. The speakers will introduce themselves. So with that in mind, Jesus, start.
So hi everybody. My name is Crespo-Cuaresma, like Valentin very rightly pronounced before. I'm a professor of economics here at the Department of Economics. I'm a macroeconometrician, so I'm an applied econometrician working mostly with statistical modeling of socioeconomic phenomena. And in particular, I work on issues related to economic growth, economic development, and the interaction between economic growth and environmental outcomes, as well as the role that the environment plays as a driver of migration and forced migration. As you can imagine, in that type of work, I work in super interdisciplinary teams. I work with geographers, with sociologists, with anthropologists, with mathematicians, with meteorologists, and basically, among the many other things that we publish, we also publish stuff that is being used by international organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I guess is the reason why I'm sitting here. And I'm very much looking forward to this. Pass it over.
Thank you. And with that, we've established that I'm Anke and I'm not the most polite person in the room. I will try to do better. I'm also late. But it's quite frequently, I'm sorry, trying to juggle different things at once. Now I'm very happy to be here. I'm a professor at the Central European University here in Vienna. They're focusing mostly on social ecology and ecological economics. My background is very much in social metabolism and material flow accounting, including environmentally extended input-output analysis, and as such, I'm someone who comes from a background where I very much enjoy working with quantitative data and with big data sets, and then only more recently in my career did I come to realize that even that data has its limitations, and that especially if we're interested in questions of social inequality, and we think those are important as well, then not all of that can be expressed in numbers. And so I recently had the great opportunity to collaborate more and more with people who have a lot of great insights into qualitative research and what it teaches us about degrowth, and I'm hoping to bring both of those aspects into the day-to-day. I'm very much looking forward to it.
I'm Colleen Schneider. I'm a PhD student, researcher, lecturer at the Institute for Ecological Economics here at the Wien. My work focuses on the political economy of monetary and fiscal policy and social development transformation. More recently around the macroeconomics of the degrowth transition. Sorry for the come from the more degrowth leaning position in this, but I'm looking forward to the discussion and to learning more about what's to go through.
Good afternoon. Very happy to be here back at WU, I could say, because my name is Elisabeth Götze and I've been teaching at WU for quite a while, and I also noticed some people I know from before in the audience. But I'm actually here not as an academic, but as a politician. For now, I'm a member of the National Parliament and of the Green Party, and there I'm a spokesperson for business and economy. And usually people ask me, how can you be spokesperson at the Green Party for business and economy? How does that go together? And actually that is what I'm trying to explain, and what we also try to put into practice in the last coalition, when we were in a government together with our coalition partner, the VP. Yeah, I'm very happy to talk about degrowth, even though in practice, in the sort of real life challenges, to bring it into practice, it may pose some problems.
Hi everyone. I'll start by saying it's really impressive to see so many of you in the room today. From my experiences, typically in the university, degrowth is something we talk about from September until March, and then we kind of take a break from it when the weather gets nice. So it's so nice to see so many of you on a more than 20-degree day here in Vienna. I'm Logan Strenchock. I'm the Environmental and Sustainability Officer at CEU. I'm an organic farmer on a 4-hectare organic farm about 1 hour outside of Budapest. I'm the co-founder of a degrowth-inspired cargo bicycle and local food distribution collective, which is called Carbonomia. I'm on the governing board of the Hungarian Agroecology Network. And with the team of people I work with and collaborate with in Budapest, we organized the 2016 International Degrowth Conference, and I remained connected to this face of degrowth, which is embodied in the international conferences. But what I want to bring to the discussion today is a perspective from the side of practice, and I want to speak about the potentials of linking the degrowth movement and what has become the contemporary degrowth movement more to the visible and invisible movement of experimenters, tinkerers, practitioners, organizers, builders, artists, and makers, and I think we can have a fruitful discussion about this today. And thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think no one likes it when someone other than the speakers talks a lot at the beginning of a panel discussion, which is why I'm going to make a short introduction. Yeah, but really short. I hope it provides some useful context. So, climate change is just the tip of the iceberg. 6 of 9 planetary boundaries have been already reached, pushing us dangerously close to the ecosystem collapse and threatening the foundations of human life that we depend upon. Equally important are the multiple ongoing social crises. So despite unprecedented global wealth, billions of people still lack access to basic necessities, such as clean water, adequate food, healthcare, education, and decent housing. There has been progress on some social indicators, but not all. As you can see on this chart, for example, here there's an inner circle and an outer circle, and the segments in the inner circle represent different social indicators. The first, this is called a donut. The first donut here is for 1992. The second is for 2015. So you will see here that there has been some progress since 1992, and this is for the whole world, this is global, on things like life expectancy, LE, nutrition and U, sanitation, SA, and education, ED. But some things have been worsening. For example, EQ, equality, and DQ, democratic equality. So there is progress in some areas, but not all. And even the progress that was achieved in the selected areas has come at an environmental cost, and that is a huge one. So these expanding red areas that you see, the big ones in the outer circle, this is the ecological overshoot since 1992, and that has increased a lot. So you see here that, for example, the CO2 emissions boundary has been reached in 1992 already, but now it's way outside that boundary. And the same goes for phosphorus and nitrogen pollution, which is driven by the use of fertilizers in industrial agriculture, ecological and material footprint. And speaking about material footprint, as you can see on this slide, it's very highly correlated with GDP growth. So material use here on this chart, and this is from 1990, but you can probably see a similar pattern before. It goes hand in hand with GDP growth. So, because it makes sense, to grow the economy, we need to extract more resources. That means material use. Some economists argue there has been some dematerialization in the global north, for example. but that's, yeah, you cannot see that here, that's more a topic of discussion. You could say though that even despite that we are increasing the material use, we've overstepped the ecological boundaries, you still need growth for social progress. And indeed here, you can see that there is correlation, for example, with Human Development Index and such measures as GDP per capita. We've been taught here at WU that correlation is not causation, of course, but you could imagine, let's say, someone saying, okay, for these countries with low human development, let's just make sure they get richer, and then they will have good human development, and for that we will need global aggregate GDP growth, of course. But according to some recent studies, that's also not a given. So for example, you can have decent living, which means things like food, sanitation, housing, healthcare, and more, while only using 30% of the current global energy use and resources, so the things we already use. And that's because the resources are not only used for things that are covering people's basic needs, but also for maybe less necessary things such as luxury goods, private jets, military, things like that. So there's a lot of production, but not all of that goes towards satisfying human needs. So our question is, do we actually need aggregate economic growth to achieve a good life for all within planetary boundaries? Can we have sustainability without growth? And now we'll start with the questions.
Thank you, Valentin. And speakers, so the first round is going to be an open question to all of you, and this is to convey the position to the audience. So we can start with Jesus and about what the mic can be passed on to the left. Yeah? So the first question is, can sustainability be achieved without confronting the growth imperative? What is your core position and why?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it sounds so much cooler when I'm introduced as Jesus than when I'm introduced as Jesus. Great, so let me start by putting the cards on the table. I don't understand what the growth imperative is. I think that the idea of the growth imperative, that I guess I will call myself a mainstream economist. As a mainstream economist, that the concept just does not exist. We don't use the terminology. I investigated a bit what it means, by the way, and it seems to lie upon a misunderstanding about how economic growth processes take place, in particular in the developed world. The main driving forces of economic growth, meaning GDP per capita growth, meaning individual incomes or household incomes growth in the developed world, is mostly innovation and accumulation of human capital. Okay, as opposed to other parts of the world where that need not be the case. Which basically means that the imperative of growing in the long run is just the imperative of being more innovative, having more human ingenuity, having a more educated labor force that is at the same time more able to create new ideas and to eventually adopt technologies that come from somewhere else and put them as part of their process to make the next generations richer than they were before, and therefore, as you already saw before, healthier and more educated, actually also more democratic. The democratic problems that you were mentioning are actually well known to be less of a problem as economic growth increases as compared to when economic growth stagnates. So that's my first point. I don't understand what this growth imperative is. Now, if I think in the future about will sustainability be reached with or without economic growth, I cannot imagine a way in which it would be achievable without economic growth, in the sense that the type of policies that need to be in place for us to be able to achieve sustainability require such enormous social effort that the social consensus that you need cannot be achieved in a stagnating economy where you have a zero-sum game in terms of redistribution between the winners of such policies and the most important target, which is the losers of that policy. We have seen that historically with any type of policy, and in particular with environmental policy. So economic growth actually, and with that I mean higher living standards, are actually much more of a prerequisite than an obstacle to actually be able to implement the type of policies that we need to implement. We have on top of that a little bit of a window of opportunity in the long run, because as of 2080, according to the projections of the UN, population will have reached its peak at the global level. That means that at the global level, we will be able also to become richer without having to produce more. Just by producing the same, incomes per capita will increase, thanks to the fact that we will have depopulation over the last quarter of the 21st century, which actually could make our job a little bit easier, a job which is enormously complicated, and of course, without growth, which again, for me means without innovation, without education, without human ingenuity, I don't think it's going to happen.
Do you want to? Thank you. I want to position myself quite clearly, and then just a few explanatory remarks, and then I think we have lots of time for discussion. I absolutely think that we can have what I would understand sustainability to mean here. So well-being within perhaps the planetary boundaries, or in a way that is environmentally non-destructive, well-being for as many people as possible, ideally for all. I think that is something that we can have without economic growth. In fact, it's something I think we could have without capitalism, without money, without sort of the need even for financial markets. I think that in sort of this system that we currently have, this capitalist economic system, I understand that we don't see kind of any other way to get things done than to have new inventions, to have more, to have, what maybe in sort of the more traditional Western academic sense has been referred to as kind of development, right? Higher levels of capital investment, higher levels of technology, and currently also more digital initiatives. But that's kind of within the system, right? And I think the economic system ideally is a form in which we organize our societies, and it's not the only conceivable form, right? If it doesn't serve us, then we can organize our societies in a different way. And that gets me to this question of the growth imperative. And I don't, especially at the current level of resource use that we're at globally, I don't think that we need growth. I think we do need degrowth in the sense of less material extraction, less water use, less land use. And I think currently that's definitely achievable thanks to decades and decades of growth, because we're now at a level of resource use already where redistribution would suffice, even given current levels of population growth. Because, as was mentioned in the opening statement, we have so many forms of resource consumption that are not geared towards human needs, but are geared towards other things, right? Of course, luxuries come to mind. The military is an incredibly important part of this high level of resource consumption. So I think that's definitely, so this would have been my interpretation of the question, and I think that that's something that's not only possible, but is absolutely necessary, given the environmental impacts and the social inequalities that pursuing this growth-oriented path in the past has in fact brought us to. And I think I'm not sure whether we really, I mean, maybe in certain contexts we do need to confront this growth imperative, right? But at the same time, I think maybe that's not necessarily the central question. I think the central question for us is, what do we need? Who needs what? And how can we get what people need to them in a way that's environmentally, causes environmentally as little harm as possible, and helps reduce rather than exacerbate social inequalities. I think that's a question that we have to confront, and it's a question that even, I would say, within degrowth and within degrowth movements, we've partially been sidestepping. So there have been, I think, smaller groups that have tackled with this. There's some reluctance, of course, to prescribe to people what their basic needs should be, right? And I understand that. That's a really difficult conversation to have, but I think it's one that we do need to have. And so I think what we need to confront is this question of what do we need, and what is it worth, right? To get what we think we need. And then sometimes maybe we'll find that things we thought we needed, when we figure out how we're actually getting them, maybe we can say, okay, maybe they're not as important as we originally thought they were. And I think there's, obviously a lot of room for debate, but a lot of room for improvement as well. And kind of just as one final thought on this idea of progress, and we're sitting here in a very wealthy country in the global north, and maybe from this perspective, it's much easier to say, I really don't need more, I need less of things. But at the same time, I think it's ridiculous if we look at the system, the amounts of resources we use, all of the research that has gone into all of the things around us is going into it, and that we're not all, each and every one of us here, like living the life of ultimate luxury, right? I mean, think about it. Everything that's gone into building this world around us, and still, if you ask people, are you living a good life? Are you happy? A lot of people, a lot of the time, would say, well, we're all very aware that there are lots of people who are a lot worse off than we are, right? But it's not kind of an enthusiastic, yes, I'm living my best life. People are stressed, people are robbed of social interactions, of community, of pursuing their dreams, of doing the things they really want to do. Not everyone is kind of thriving and healthy. There's a lot of social pressure, there's a lot of feeling of competition, there's anxiety about the future, all of these things. And that at levels of resource use that are unprecedented, right? And then we think doing more will make things better, and I'm not sure that that's the case. So I really think we need to rethink what well-being and what our own well-being and that of others means to us, and then go into the debate on what we need and how we get that within planetary boundaries. I'm looking forward to that discussion. Colleen.
So I hope it holds up, and I'm glad I have my phone. I sat down at my desk yesterday morning to think through how I wanted. Good. Just yell at me if you need me to be louder. I put it closer to my mouth. How I wanted to respond to this question about sustainability and the growth imperative. And as I sat there, I was feeling. I feel like I'm eating the microphone. I'm usually very loud, so this is not normally a problem for me. As I sat there at my desk yesterday, I was feeling remarkably overwhelmed. Some hours before the Madeleine, the humanitarian aid ship that was part of the Freedom Flotilla, attempting to break the blockade on Gaza, had been seized in international waters by Israeli forces. At the same time, the National Guard had been deployed to my, for many years, home of Los Angeles, and along with police forces and now an entire Marine battalion is violently repressing community-based resistance to the ICE raids, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement raids happening in Los Angeles and throughout the US. And the question of the freedom for Palestinians, the question of the status of immigrants in the US, these questions are not separate from ecological questions. They're not separate from the question of sustainability. Nancy Fraser refers to capitalism as an institutionalized social order. And I think this is actually a useful way to think about it. And it's a social order that was built upon and continues to rely upon expropriation and exploitation of disenfranchised peoples in our high income, in our wealthy economies, as well as of the global south as a whole, and of the natural world herself. Right? The exploitation of people on the planet are not two separate things as well. So economic growth relies on these forms of exploitation. And the way we're able to live in the global north is due to net transfers of money, land, labor, and resources from the south. It's the reason we're able to live the lifestyle that we live. And at the same time, the gains of economic growth go towards assuaging the very damages that it causes, but in some ways and for some groups of people. Growth is not necessary for well-being, but growth is necessary to reproduce a particular regime of power relations, which comes a bit to, I would say, my understanding of the growth imperative that differs from how you talk about it. And even that tinkering around the edges and aiming for technocratic fixes does nothing to change these dynamics, except for the tinkering you mentioned. I don't think that's good tinker. So the question was, can sustainability be achieved without confronting the growth imperative? I think no, because we need to confront this seeming obsession that we have with growth and understand why that's there and who benefits from it. And in doing that, we can't effectively do that, right? Confront this growth imperative without also confronting questions of social justice, of democracy, of power, and of how we relate to the natural world and to our role in it. These things are not separate. And maybe just a aside on the democracy comment. I come from the US, and I think which is clearly a wealthy nation, I think one would be hard pressed to argue that the levels of democracy there have not significantly deteriorated. So
They have indeed. We have data that they have indeed deteriorated over the last years in the US.
okay.
But that doesn't still break the correlation between income per capita and democracy levels, which is on average positive for countries of the world, even when the economy is right.
Well, when we talk about growth, we have to ask what is growth, and usually we measure it by talking about GDP. And there is a big discussion to measure it beyond GDP, because what makes our life good, and you were talking about a good life, I think that's what we are looking for. And GDP probably is not what measures good life. I think we largely could agree on that. So I think it's about looking at this growth imperative from a different perspective. And I wouldn't necessarily talk about growth or degrowth, but where do we want to grow, or what should grow and what should definitely not grow. And with regards to that, we first have to agree on different measures, and that's what we implemented actually, at least in Austria and also on the EU level. Of course, GDP still is the sort of economic indicator which holds everywhere and where you can compare countries easily with regards to development. But I think we should be aware of what does it make to other levels like life expectancy, social security, health issues, also environmental destroyment as a major factor. And we implemented the Produktivitätsrat. I don't know the English term, but it's something about competitiveness and productivity board. And it produces every year, since 2022, it produces a report every year to measure various factors, not only GDP, but various factors. So I think that's a first attempt or a good attempt to also look at other things, not only at GDP, to measure what makes life work. Apart from that, I would also say it's important to consider, before I said where do we want to grow, so we want to transform our economy to be less or not harming. I'm not sure where we are, of course, less harming at least, to environment with regards to, for example, where does our energy come from? Should it be from fuels, from fossil energy or atomic energy? As in Austria, we say this is not sustainable. I know there's different approaches to that, of course, or should it come from renewables? So we have a transformation there, and I think we need growth there, of course. So degrowth there wouldn't make sense from that perspective. Also circular economy is something which is very important because, as we know, we have been exploiting environment, and there is, of course, limits to these boundaries. But we have to make sure that the resources which have been exploited are used properly and reused and reused and reused. And I see growth potential there. And also with regards to innovation. I'm not the person who thinks innovation can save all our problems, but I think, for example, in Austria, in circular economy, we are quite good at that, and we can, also in Europe, and we can profit from innovations in that sense and sort of have some growth within companies there.
It's a tough position to go fifth after so much has been said. Maybe it's even a tougher position to be sitting in front of a room of economists, as someone who's not an economist. I have a question for all of you, is how you've let your field go on for so long, being largely driven by myths. We're here today to talk about the idea of the myth of achieving constant economic growth in a finite planet and whether this is even achievable or desirable. And I want to remind us that in your studies you probably had a lot, or someone spent a lot of energy trying to encourage you to be able to predict market changes and predict chaos. Well, an economic system which is based on myths and not actually the physical or social realities of our planet is one that's going to have a lot of chaos in it. So I want to connect this more to what degrowth offers, which is not the hope for a recession, an unplanned recession. It offers something different, which is a concrete plan to link our economy, and not just our economy, but the societies that we live in. Because I hope you as economists also realize that we're Homo sapiens, we're not Homo economics or whatever, we're not going to developed on this planet to just operate in an economic system. We developed on this planet to interact socially. And what degrowth can offer us is a plan for creating something different, which is compatible with the planet's biophysical limits, and which maybe is even compatible with the social limits, for helping human beings actually live comfortably, live sanely, live without the pressures that the current profit-oriented economic system has placed upon us. And I would connect this back to the question that Anke brought up. And it's not necessarily just how happy are you, but who in this room lives without the pressures imposed on them by the economic system that they were born into. And how can we work towards reality where no matter what country, nation state you're born into, you develop freely as a curious, social, artistic, creative human being, and not one that hopefully has the space in the economic system they were born into to be forced on a development path. And that's what, the degrowth perspective, a lot of the energy, time that has been put into not just the intellectual side of degrowth, but the actual physical community-based projects of degrowth, is working to elaborate better. And even though we can say that the movement is still quite young, I think it's built on multiple decades of work. I don't just follow the definition that you might hear from the French school of degrowth, which is that in the 1970s, some French scholars started using the word degrowth, and this is where all these ideas came from. The contemporary narratives in degrowth are built on multiple decades of human rights, of gender equality movement, of racial equality movement, of environmental consciousness, social consciousness, and we brought it to the state where we're having discussion in one of the forefront economic universities in Vienna. We're having these discussions in the European Parliament. We're having these discussions in different places. So that's a good progress point, but it's up to all of us to take this forward and turn the degrowth plan into the degrowth practice. And actually, once we get to the point of being aware of different ways of doing things ourselves, the next step that we can do is help to work to empower others to free themselves from these social pressures that have been imposed on them by the economic system we were all born into. So I want to make sure that we leave the room today remembering that degrowth is not a mindless hope for recession that would cause some reduction in energy consumption and material consumption, but it is a concrete plan, and it has been elaborated very well by people even much more eloquent and who put a lot more time into it, and there is scientific proof for its possibility, which can be applied to many different fields.
Thank you, speakers. I will pass on the mic button to the next round of questions.
All right, so now we have some questions that we put some information on our speakers up on the internet. I mean, we know some of the speakers already. And we try to think of questions that are relevant to your backgrounds, but if we miss, let us know. So, also thanks everyone for the input. I'm really so glad that we got all these people here in the same room today, because a feeling I had as a SEEP student was that the SEEP doesn't talk much to the other departments at the VU. So, for example, the economics department. And I think that's not so great, because it's nice to be in a bubble, talking about degrowth and stuff. But sometimes you need to start talking to other people and learn also what they think. And so I think, also this event here is good for that, and then also for people who are not at VU to learn something new. So the question I have now is for Jesus. We found, or we read in your articles that you find evidence in support of, for example, things that are not necessarily aligned with degrowth, or things like the presence of an environmental cousins curve. So could you tell us more about that, and how could that maybe help us achieve sustainability?
Thank you very much. Actually, let me first say, we are super easy to reach, right? There was this girl there in the back, she just stopped me on my way to the office, and she went like, hey, would you like to participate in here? Please back me up on this. I agreed immediately, right? So it's as easy as that. Now, I think that out of the first round of statements, there appears to be a different understanding of how to approach these type of questions, and in particular the question which is stated here. So I'm a scientist, I'm a social scientist. My job is to use the scientific method to provide evidence that would then hopefully be used by politicians, in the best case scenario, in order for them to implement the most efficient possible policies, right? So that's how I saw my role in here. That's why to the first question I was just answering with a series of empirical facts. And I will also do the same thing with this question right now. Now, as you may have known or you may have read, I've been a very vocal, critical person towards the degrowth movement because of the part in which they sold themselves as a scientific theory. So I have nothing against activism, as long as they don't get me. I don't have any problem about political statements, but we need to be very clear in differentiating that of the job that I do here every day and that most of us do here every day, which is the use, just like a worker does, of the scientific method to make us understand reality better. Within that type of work that I do every day, apart from teaching many of the students who are sitting here, where I obviously offer myths to them, but we will talk about it in a minute. Within the job, a lot of the work that I've been doing is actually related to whether something like an environmental goodness curve exists or not, like you rightly said. Now, I approach that question as a side, that's my deforestation goodness curve. Not only mine, actually, by the way, it's of a lot of people as well, in particular of Olga, who is the remote sensing person who actually gave us the data. So when I approach those questions, I approach them with the following research question. I want to understand what is the relationship between economic development and a particular type of environmental outcome, in this case, deforestation. I don't have a preconceived idea about what's going to come out. I am there to discover it. So I don't have a program about a negative relationship should come out or a positive relationship should come out. I'm not setting up the social objectives. That's democracy is there for that. I'm providing you the evidence. I'm providing you the evidence in the best way possible using the most rigorous methods out there, okay? Which is very far away from offering myths. And I think that anybody that has attended an economics seminar, a research seminar, or a research conference would understand that what we economists are doing in the 21st century, and the 20th century as well, part of it at least, is very far away from offering myths. We are offering the best possible empirical methods in order to answer very, very important questions. Now, having said that, the question is, if there was something like an environmental goodness curve, I only find half of it, by the way, in the world, does that mean that when we grow, everything will eventually be fine? The answer is clearly no. We have a lot of evidence on decoupling, in particular of CO2, basically for a lot of more and more countries over time, but that decoupling is by no means quick enough for us to be able to achieve the 1.5 degree, you can forget, but achieve the Paris Agreement goals, forget. We're not going to make it with business as usual. That means we're going to need the help of politics and of policymakers to do something. Now, we economists are the ones that then go to the data and analyze which policies are efficient in order to, for example, reduce CO2. Okay, we created even a super cool visualization, if you go one step further, called the World Emissions Plot, which is a visualization of some of the work that we do at our department in order to try to understand what does it take to reach the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree, whatever you want, by sector, based on the best possible methods. Okay? I don't know if that's a myth or not, but it's the best possible empirical work you can do. And now, we create all of that, and we get to the conclusion, actually, as you can see in there, and I will have to explain to you what that is, but as you could see in there, actually we're not going to get there. We're not going to reduce CO2 emissions to the extent that would be possible unless we do something. And then, what we need to do should be, I hope we all agree, will have to be done with democratic means, meaning finding a social consensus about how we deal with that, and that means that we're going to have to do it by convincing ourselves as society that we need to do this. Okay? I think that things like, I don't know, we should smash capitalism or whatever, change something, I don't think that that is leading towards the objective of creating consensus in society. That would be required for us not to be on the red line up there, but to be on the green line. And on top of that, whether you want to destroy capitalism or not, I could not care less. I cannot argue scientifically on that. I can argue with a glass of wine, but that is not science. That's me telling you something over a bottle of wine. Okay? I think that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Now a question to Anke. Your work on social metabolism shows that economic growth in industrial societies has consistently required an increasing material and energy throughput, often outsourced to the global south. From this perspective, do you think green growth is realistic?
Thank you. So this question on green growth, right, which I would understand to mean the more general framing again of can we keep growing and do it in an environmentally benign and sustainable way, is something that I've addressed throughout my research and will continue to address very scientifically. And even though this pro-capitalist activist is sitting here on my side,
reading very weirdly between the lines.
Sorry, I'm only kidding. I think the interesting thing with activism is always that sometimes if we're defending the status quo, it's not activism, and if we're advocating for change, it is. And if we're, and I think research is research, even if it employs different methods. But anyways, so working through this from a social metabolism perspective, where we look at material resource extraction and then also trade between economies, but also at the subnational level. So we look at, for example, what is extracted in rural areas, what is required by cities, what, from their so-called hinterland, what are the sectors that are emitting, what do they produce while they're emitting, all of these things. And what we've seen is at least a lack of evidence and of empirical evidence of basically any economy so far being able to, as it's often called, decouple economic growth from growth in resource use, including land and water and materials, as well as in emissions. Especially if we're looking not only at a so-called production-based method, so where we're looking at the resource use on the territory of that economy, but if we're also looking consumption-based, which usually means that in some way, shape, or form, we try to estimate the resources, no matter where in the world they're extracted, that are needed to satisfy a given level of final demand, right? And there, we find that across all of the actually quite rigorous scientific studies that have been done, there's so far no evidence that we can achieve this kind of decoupling, right? Now I'm also I'm a researcher, and that means that maybe I have a little bit more of a positive relation to stories or myths, because I think basically a story, a narrative, is at the heart of any research question. I ask, could it be this way? And then I go into the data and I look, right? And that also means for me that just because we haven't seen evidence yet of an economy that can continue growing financially, economically, and can use less resources, it doesn't mean it's not possible. And But I think what's interesting is to sort of not take the capitalist economic system and say, well, this is, what we have, and I can only bear to talk about it if I have some alcohol in me. But to say that this is an economic system that we can analyze very rigorously. We can understand how it works. We can understand, and I'm not talking kind of just in your basic Marx 101, the need for profit and the doubly free workers who are free to sell their labor and free of the means of production, but I mean that we can see how the capitalist economic system works in practice in countries today, right? And this is where I come into again that I understand that a lot of the more quantitative research that I've done in the past really only shows half of the, if that, part of the picture, because if we're looking at kind of just nationally aggregate resource use and we're looking at nationally aggregate GDP per capita averages or GDP in total, we're not really seeing a lot of kind of what drives decision making, right? And what drives decision making of the actors who leverage the big resource flows. And there's qualitative research that's extremely interesting and that teaches us how these actors operate within the economic system and how they perceive this economic system. And that's hugely important because whatever the theory of that system is well and good, but if that's not the way that actors experience it, then that's not kind of what they make their decisions in accordance to, right? And kind of the forces that are at play there, the need, for example, to generate profit, the need to be cost efficient, right? I mean, that's huge. That's huge also in terms of being able to reduce the environmental impact of activities if I always have to choose the more cost-efficient route. That's also huge in terms of not wanting to exploit the global south. If basically through capitalist colonial relations of the past and present, we've made it so that we can get cheap labor and cheap resources from the global south, and in the capitalist system we've made it so that we need to be cost efficient in our production. Well then what's going to happen? Where is resource extraction going to expand? Where are we going to exploit labor? This is, to me, has nothing, I'm also an activist, this has very little to do with my activism and a lot to do with my analysis of current conditions. And then I'm very happy to discuss this on that level. And I think that the interesting thing is if we're going into sort of the social metabolism perspective, for example, to use this very specific case that was brought up here around the relationship between average income and deforestation, right? So that's something that we've, people doing social metabolism research and people who are much more knowledgeable about this than I am, and Simone Gingrich at the FOCU is one of kind of the foremost researchers on this, if anyone is interested. What she found is that we have this so-called forest transition, it's called, especially in the high-income countries. So not only is deforestation going down, but actually these are countries that are increasing their forest cover. Where initially we would say, well, that's great, right? And this time we need more carbon sinks, we want less built-up land. Unfortunately, these are also the countries that what they're losing is agricultural land, actually, and that's being turned into both forest and built-up land. But that's a longer side story. But then we look more closely, and we find that this forest transition is contingent on two big underlying developments. One is actually that it's directly related to deforestation elsewhere, so that which is through the direct and indirect imports of wood products, especially also of paper and pulp products. I don't know if anyone remembers this kind of from the onset of the COVID pandemic. There was a huge shortage in supply even of recycled of paper. Because everyone was ordering everything online and all paper and pulp resources, even recycled paper, was going into making cardboard for retailer packaging, right? And to be able to send things around. So this is a huge deal, and it's hugely related. Kind of, sometimes we think of forestry as, it's biomass, it's only about kind of packaging, it can be recycled, it feels so benign, but it's so directly related to aspects of mass consumption and accelerated mass consumption. So, sorry, I got a little bit sidetracked, but so the one thing is that we're getting paper and pulp from elsewhere, yeah, or the raw materials for paper and pulp. And the second thing is that it's directly related to the rate of use of fossil energy. So we have no evidence of any country, and this includes Austria, even though Austria meets so much of its electricity demand, not all of energy, but of its electricity demand from renewable sources and from hydroelectricity. These countries have extremely high rates of fossil energy consumption, and in many cases even growing rates of fossil energy consumption, which is maybe then something that we also talk about when we talk about this question of the energy transition, right? Where are examples of how that renewable transition is a transition away from fossil fuels, and where are examples of where that renewable transition is actually an addition to, on top of the existing consumption of fossil energy, or where increased fossil energy consumption is the prerequisite to being able to enable a renewable energy transition. And as much as I think that renewable energy is definitely part of the solution, part of the direction that we want to go into, I think we have to be extremely mindful of forms of renewable energy use that are only possible on the basis of fossil energy, because that's not a transition to me, that's sort of the same energy system using the new forms. And these are all things that, for me, come very strongly from the social metabolism perspective. So from what do we see if we look at the material requirements, and if I say material, I usually mean material resources, energy resources, land, water, that are associated with our current way of producing and consuming and organizing our production and consumption.
Sorry, can I play empirical watchdog for a second? Because I think that one of the statements was actually wrong, the one about decoupling of consumption, CO2 in consumption, because you showed the data before. That's the UK, just as an example. You have consumption-based CO2 emissions, because you said that there's no example. That's one example.
So you love in high inclinations where there's absolute decoupling of CO2 emissions from GDP, but as you said, nowhere near the scale and speed necessary to meet our Paris agreements.
But you said there is no simple example of decoupling in consumption.
Oh, I'm sorry. So if we're looking at environmental indicators overall, yeah, there are definitely, for example,
in other resources, you're right.
Yeah, so for some examples for CO2, some examples for waste, right? So we have some examples even for plastics. Lots of examples for the use of biomass, which, we're trying to go towards. So yes, there are definitely isolated examples of specific things that have been that are decoupled, but we don't have economy-wide decoupling of environmental impact. I didn't realize, I didn't think I talked specifically about emissions. I'm sorry if I gave the impression.
Thank you so much for that insight, Anke. I think that's, I think you brought in very important and I think critical perspectives into ideas and goals that we normally don't even question in our day-to-day lives. And I think it's very important that you brought those to the room, and I think people will have a lot of takeaways from that. On that note, the next question is for Colleen. And Colleen, you spoke a little bit about, thank you for raising very important issues in your opening statement as well, about Palestine, about the crackdown on the immigration, the protests against the crackdown on the immigration, on immigrants in California. Just to kind of talk about it in a more monetary sense. You said when we talk about growth and when we talk about consumption, you said it's important to also look at why and who benefit from this production and from this cycle of production that we're living in. And since you also work a lot on monetary theory, I don't know if it's something that we want to introduce into the conversation right now. But at this point, just to maybe introduce it simply, much of public policy assumes that economic growth is necessary to fund these basic necessities such as healthcare, education, and pensions. So, what do you say to that idea that social welfare is inherently dependent on growth, and how does anyone challenge that?
What do I say to the idea that social welfare depends on growth? So first, what are we assuming if we say social welfare depends on growth? We're assuming the capacity for the state to fund a social welfare system relies on what it takes in, primarily through taxation. So what it takes in, it can then go back out. And that the level of tax income is tied to the size of the economy. We're then also assuming or expecting that the total outlay on spending for social welfare is going to increase over time. And this can happen through growth in demands on the welfare system or through increasing relative costs. And you think about the healthcare system as an example. Growth in demands would be there's increasing incidences of chronic diseases in nearly all high-income countries, which puts increasing burdens on the healthcare system, right? So this is growth in demands. At the same time, healthcare services are increasingly privatized and increasingly financialized, which leads to increasing relative costs. So with these growing demands, if we rely on taxing of the these systems, then we need economic growth to ensure social welfare. And I want to argue that that's not the case. So I'm going to first talk about our capacity to finance policies to support social welfare, and then talk a bit about the structure of sustainable social welfare policies and why that matters moving beyond growth drivers as well. So I work on monetary theory. I'll talk about the money system, the monetary system for a moment. We have a fiat monetary system. That means the money we use isn't, it's not tied to some commodity, right? It's the gold standard era. Probably all know that when banks issue loans, this is new money that's created that didn't exist before. When those loans are putting back, that money is destroyed. This is the banking monetary circuit. There's a fiscal monetary circuit when the political authority of the state spends money into existence. This is new money that didn't exist before. That money is taken out of the system through the process of taxation. This happens with fiscal spending on welfare services, for example. This is new money that's spent into the public sector. These points are not contentious, right? Central bankers acknowledge this. And this is how money creation happens. The state has the capacity to use the money that it creates to mobilize its domestic resources. I'll just say that again. The state has the capacity to use the money that it creates to mobilize its domestic resources. Keynes wrote a book called How to Pay for the War, right? In reference to talking about the Second World War. And nothing in that book was about how you actually finance it, how you pay for it. It was all about how you mobilize real resources and what the real limits to what you can do are in terms of the resources you have access to and in terms of maintaining price stability, right? Avoiding excess levels of inflation. So the limits to spending are our availability of real resources, and just in the domestic sense right here. So the availability of physical resources, of energy, of labor. Those are real limits to spending. The pertinent monetary question then isn't how do we fund the welfare system, but how do we mobilize the necessary resources for a welfare system and maintain price stability, right, as a part of that. And also, I would argue, respect ecological limits and how that spending is structured and how it structures production and consumption. So those are real limits. we're all sitting here in Austria, in the EU, and we have here politically imposed limits as well, right? We have debt and deficit limits, all EU member nations do. And I think it's important to understand that those are politically imposed limits, and that also there's been interesting events in recent years, right, that show kind of the potential malleability of how we understand these politically imposed limits. The Stability and Growth Pact went on hold during COVID to allow for the necessary spending to deal with responses to the pandemic. Germany's made exemptions to their debt rules around military spending, right, which is quite novel, which shows the geopolitical constraints have shifted some pretty long-term hardwired ideas around fiscal spending and around debt. There's also strategies many states employ where they're basically creating public-private partnerships to book things off balance sheet so that your spending just doesn't show up as a part of your debt. Austria is quite good at that. So do we need to rely on increasing taxes basically to fund a social welfare state? I would say no, but we need to effectively address our political limits. Understand those and address those effectively. We also need to address the structure of the welfare system to move beyond an economy that relies on growth for stability. So that means understanding social welfare as eco-social welfare, right? Structured in such a way that it is eco-social policy, that we're bringing together our social and ecological goals, and that it's decommodified. Right? This, of course, points to universal public services as ways of meeting basic needs within planetary boundaries or within ecological limits. Right? This way of understanding social welfare, eco-social welfare, I think is critical if we're looking at this kind of top-down analysis of the role of the state and moving towards I'll just say degrowth oriented system of social welfare. Pensions were mentioned, so maybe I'll just say a word on this briefly. Financialized pensions, there's a very clear growth driver there, right? If your pension's paid into the financial system, then you're relying on that system to be stable, continue to grow, to have a pension come out of it at the end. If you have a pay-go scheme, which is still largely as predominant in Europe, although obviously the US, Australia have massive financialized pension schemes, then the state pays out pensions to pensioners, right? And they can make up the gap effectively in what's being paid in and what's being paid out when you have aging populations, etc. And I would argue that this is not inherently problematic. So financialized pensions are problematic, right, in terms of moving away from a need for growth in order to ensure people's social welfare is met. Yeah, and that's what I wanted to highlight in this question was the understanding the real fiscal capacity and the importance of decommodified eco-social welfare policies.
Thank you. So Elisabeth, you're doing politics, and we want to ask a question about eco, but you already spoke to that. So I have a different question. Could you tell us a bit about your day-to-day work and how your party thinks about these issues? Because you're also, I think we saw on the website that you advocate for sufficiency policies, so for example. So to everything that's been discussed so far, also about the limits imposed on the politicians, what would you say to that? What are the challenges that you face, and how do you think about these problems? Like when you or your party need to introduce a policy that's promoting sustainability, how do you do that?
So you won't be surprised, I'm a big fan, it sounds strange, but of democracy and democratic processes. So as a party, we are elected to do what we claimed we wanted to do, or what we said. And one of the things was to bring down or to reduce emissions, CO2 emissions and other emissions, to close the gap in between environmental damage and still provide a good life. So what we feel is what is needed is policies which regulate what companies do. And Anke, you have before been talking about, I think, cost efficiency. And as long as it's cost efficient for companies to harm the environment, they would do that, probably because they are in a system where they can do it. And they should do it because at the end of the year, their investors would claim did you do as much as was asked to be as profitable as possible. So if we change the environment in that sense, that we provide additional costs on harming the environment, of course they are tempted or they must change their policies, and that's what we could see. We would impose CO2 prices on CO2 emissions in 2022, starting 2022 in Austria. And from that time on, we could see, and of course you could see this was also partly because of COVID and because of other issues. But it seems there was a reduction of CO2 emissions since then, even though there was minor growth already. So some sort of decoupling. I'm not saying this is the only measure we did or we should do, and from academia we know it must be different measures, and it's a combination of measures. By the way, policy always has to be evidence-based, so it has to be different measures, but that's what we implemented and what was put into effect, and it seemed to work. This is also what we know from other countries, so we of course looked at what other countries did, and we are catching up on that, and it's also within the EU framework. I wanted to also catch up on what you said before about child labor, I think it was, or working conditions in some other countries, I think. And there, for example, is what has been discussed lately very heavily, the CSDD, so the due diligence directive by EU, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, Lieferkettengesetz for the Germans here, which is heavily discussed again because it seems some companies or also some parties feel this is too strict and it harms our competitiveness. We feel it's a way to regulate what must be regulated because the market in that sense does not is not enough of a solution to a problem which we know is a problem, which is, for example, child labor or very bad labor conditions. Probably there's also other ways to solve this, so probably we can discuss that later. But to sum up, I think it's the task of governments, it's the task of politicians to provide a framework, working conditions for companies, for people, with regards to taxes, with regards to other measures, to regulate what companies, what everyone can do, should do, and must not do. And to be honest, the best thing, for example, is to regulate with regards to, like for example, on highways. In Austria, you are allowed to drive 130, and we know by evidence 100 would be the best option. But that's a good, would be much better with regards to emissions. But that's a good example to show that sometimes what you know you cannot put through because you're not in a leading position. So we know our coalition partner would never have agreed to that, and we were not able to impose that. So sometimes you have to be pragmatic in politics and do as much as you can, and you must be careful that you don't lose sort of support from the voters, because still, as I said in the beginning, it's a democracy, and we have to make sure people understand what we do, why we do, and they agree with it. Otherwise, I think we are prone to leave too much room to populists who then would change many things in a way we would not like them
Thank you, Elisabeth, for that insight. It surely must be quite difficult to tackle the electoral, the party requirements, the expectations of the public, and the old things that you want to implement in policy. Thank you. And Logan, the question of this one is for you. You spoke, I think you gave a pretty good introduction to the idea of degrowth, and you asked meaningful questions, such as living without the pressures of the capitalist system that we live in today. And the question that we have for you is, as a practitioner, you've helped implement sustainability initiatives in agriculture in Budapest and academia at CEU. So from your grassroots experience, what makes communities receptive to post-war ideas, and where do you hit walls?
Where do we hit walls? So first, thanks for your patience and sticking this out. I know we're into more than an hour, and I hope that we get to your questions very soon. So I tried to brief. This question, it brought to my mind why I sometimes feel like a misfit within a university or an academic institution. And it's definitely not because I don't appreciate good data. I love good data. And in my field, which is agroecology, organic farming, small-scale rebuilding or reimagining food systems so that they're direct instead of very indirect, we like good data as well. My problem that I have with us, and I'm speaking about us, whether you're here in this room as a student, as a professor, as a drop-in, is that I think we impose a lot of restrictions on ourselves for the limitations of our work, for the limitations of our research, and for the limitations of our research projects. And we need to challenge ourselves to break out of these self-imposed limitations. We're in a privileged, isolated bubble to have had the opportunity to pass through this institution. We acquire a lot of knowledge. We need to think about how we can use this, and how we can use this to extend the benefits of our research to communities, to active communities. We have it's quite often that as you pass through this machine, which is the higher education institution, you become disembedded. You don't really belong anywhere anymore, because you went through this cycle of looking for the good opportunity for the bachelor, looking for the good opportunity for the master, then hoping to find the research project, and we lose the true connection to community. So we have to remind ourselves that meaningful change can happen through re-embedding our knowledge, through re-embedding ourselves physically, directly into communities. And I really, truly appreciate the capacities and the reach of strong scientific research, but there is space for reintroducing participatory and community-based research and hard science-guided research, in which the goals of the project and the reach of the project are co-created together with active communities, as opposed to being decided, having the goals for the project decided first within the institution, and then sent off into the public, however we send off the results of our knowledge, either in a journal publication or somewhere else, sending it to the parliament and hope it becomes a discussion point. We have the power to re-embed our work while we're spending time in academic institutions, in active communities, whether that means a tangible place, whether that means an activist group, whether that means a civic organization. But that's our responsibility. And I believe that this re-embedding our academic research and connecting it to the social movements that are active, to the functioning civic organizations. We could start with the place where we're studying, but think back to wherever you come from, wherever you were living, I think about the necessary time that it takes to build trust. So that we stop the connotations of research, that it's something that you get dropped in and you get dropped out, that it becomes passive observation, and instead we need to think about how to turn this into actual active, co-created participation. And I think this is a way that we can address these points of where does the change start from, and what are the results of our research, how do I become happy and fulfilled in whatever subject I'm studying. So this is just something that, and it's my response to this question as well, but I hope that this stays in your mind after this discussion as well. And I'm not saying this just from my own personal feelings. So in the last 10 years, as being someone with part of a foot in the university and another foot in a completely different world, that I spoke to hundreds and hundreds of young people in an engineering program, in a social sciences program, in an international relations program, who are learning a lot and building their knowledge, but really feeling disconnected from the things that they want to physically participate in. And we have the capacity to change the notions of what is the purpose of a bachelor student, of a master's student, of a PhD thesis, of a horizon project, so that we can really embed ourselves and our work in active and functioning communities and make sure that the benefits of our work and our research project is something that extends outside of this somewhat isolated institution which we're currently in.
So, according to the initial plan that we said to you, we had a final round where we would ask the final question, yeah? But I think we're over time. So, yeah, if you're all happy to share. Yeah. All right. So, you can begin. Would you need the mic or can you speak up?
Yeah, I don't know. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah. Maybe just stand up and speak so that.
Okay. So, my first question, I have two questions. My first question is directly to the core, I think, of the problem. I'm not pro-grow, I'm not degrow. I have sympathy for degrow people, but I think the core of the core problem here is the scientific method, what we are talking about. So, what is really scientific in economics, and how can you define yourself more scientific than a physicist or on the same level than a physicist? Just because, I think that the problem is that what I found out in economics, because I'm also a researcher, is that whenever we open an economic paper, there are some assumptions that are clearly stated by the authors, but there are huge amount of assumptions that are not clearly stated by the authors. But it's because it became just a way of doing it. It's just like a way of making science in that bubble. And I'm telling this because I know that when I studied preference theory, I know that there are a certain amount of assumptions that need to be fulfilled in order to make it valuable and to make it usable. So that from that preferences, you can also build a utility function, and then from a utility function, if a certain amount of assumptions are valid, then you can also aggregate these utility functions, and then you can build the demand functions. And then if you aggregate the demand and aggregate the supply function, then you can have a general equilibrium. But then also I found out, and not through my professors, that there was actually a very huge debate that was never solved decades ago, which is the Cambridge Analytica Coventry Savon capital, was never solved. And actually, that from that controversy, we know that there is no general equilibrium we can find out. And so, to me, after a year studying economics, it looked to me more an indoctrination, especially if you start looking at different schools of thought and how many different kind of problems in this scientific method area. There are many open problems that actually go to the core of what is really scientific in economics. And the idea I have is that actually economics was an ideological position, an ideological theory, an ideological school that was probably very useful, especially for the US, especially for the Western country, to weaponize academia against the the Soviet Union and the socialism there. So I'm saying like maybe it was a good weapon at that time, but I think now it's pretty much useless, and I think it's used for other purposes. Sorry.
Who would like to answer the question?
About my economics, I've been thinking a lot about what you're saying. You are right in many things. So let me start with the very beginning. It seems like you were, and this is going to go a little bit away from the stuff we've been talking about, but I'm more than happy to answer each one of the points that you were giving. You were astonished probably by this idea of these hidden assumptions, many of them very unrealistic assumptions, that then lead to the building up of economic theory models. To be fair, old-fashioned economic theory models. Just for those of you who are not economists, the economics profession, the discipline, the scientific discipline of economics went through a very, very large revolution in the beginning of the 2000s that we like to call the credibility revolution and the empirical revolution, where basically theory started to disappear in our academic outcome, or academic output, and pure empirical papers started to appear, which were not even very much linked to the type of theory that you were talking about, even when some of them are. Now, the dominant epistemological setting in which these type of models that you were talking about was developed is something that we call the philosophy of science, the philosophers of science, called instrumentalism. The idea of instrumentalism is a special way of looking at logical positivism. So the main idea of logical positivism, I hope that you'll know about it, and if not, read Popper. The main idea of logical positivism is very straightforward. If you have a theory should be logically consistent, and it should create predictions which are falsifiable. If you have that, then the watchdogs, the econometricians, will come and try to falsify it. Okay? That is logical positivism. This is exactly the method that we use and what I personally have been calling the scientific method until now. Even when some other people, like Anke said, do not agree that there is just that scientific method, but that is, for me, the scientific method. Now, within logical positivism, the economists went one step further and they developed something called instrumentalism, which just takes that idea and it says, on top of that, whether the assumptions are realistic or not does not matter. What matters is the prediction. Okay, there's this famous paper by Milton Friedman that presents that. Now that explains a whole lot how we have been working until this empirical revolution of the beginning of the 2000s. We created logically consistent, internally logically consistent theories without caring very much about whether the assumptions matter or not, whether the assumptions were realistic or not. That they mattered, of course, every paper in economics has tried to change assumptions and see what happens afterwards. The reason why we felt historically very comfortable with instrumentalism has to do with our kind of a kink, I was going to say love, but it's kind of a kink for physics. Okay, so you kind of also kind of stated. Remember gravity? Remember 9.8 meters by squared second multiplied by time, it gives you speed. That builds on the assumption that there is no friction. Okay, there's no place in the world where there is no friction. So that gravity, as an example, builds on an assumption which is by definition wrong. Still, I have not seen anybody in the room or anywhere else or writing articles about the physicists. They build their models on assumptions which are wrong.
Yeah, but they can still do an experiment.
Yes. They have, so more on our side, we have a tougher job, right? So they can do experiments and they know even that they're using a wrong model, they still use it because it works. And that is what defines science. Defines science is that it works. In the sense that it produces stuff that you can see in reality. And in the best case scenario, things that gives you also an idea how to change things so that reality changes. That's, I think, what you were referring to when you were talking about evidence-based policy. Now, I think that answers the why we do it like we do it. Now, the present, if not, feel free to, I mean, I don't want to, but I love to talk about this stuff. I know, I have one more point. The empirical revolution has changed that completely. We don't use those models anymore, not to the extent that we used to. So a paper, take the top one, take the American Economic Review and read the papers that have been published in the last issue. They're all purely empirical.
And then,
Yeah, it's a super short question.
also maybe just let the panelists know whom it's directed to,
Yeah,
if it's directed to anybody.
I'd like maybe even the question is, do you believe in absolute decoupling? And I'd like to get like a clear answer. Maybe this is, and also maybe a counter argument, like just both sides.
I can answer that very quickly. Science does not care about what I believe, and reality does not care about what I believe, but given the evidence that we have, we observe absolute decoupling for a whole lot of resources, not for all of them, and for a whole lot of countries over time. So I think absolute decoupling will eventually be happening. And as I said before, not to the speed that would be required for us to fulfill all the Paris Agreement, not at all. But yeah, I think that it might happen if I just kind of project historical data to the future. It seems like it could happen. However, scientists don't care about what I do.
Do just a very quick round. I think that systematically, absolute decoupling is impossible unless we can come up with some way to generate profit that does not require material resources, that requires zero resources. Because otherwise, even if it requires less and less and less, there's still always going to be a little bit more of material resources associated with any additional economic growth, and therefore I think systematically it's not possible.
I would just add the point of absolute decoupling of what, right? If you ask that question generally, you're going to get different answers because people are talking about different things. Like what we want generally, often people talk about absolute decoupling is we want to continue to grow GDP and reduce all the bad environmental stuff. But whether we see that or not really depends on specifically what you're talking about. There is some absolute decoupling for some countries of greenhouse gas emissions and GDP, not for material use, likely not to be enough, but as in aggregate, it does not look like you could somehow decouple economic growth from all negative environmental impacts. That would be a dematerialized economy. That's just, I don't know, my dream last year. That's not an economy.
Yeah, thank you for this clarification. And well, as a politician, I'm actually more concerned about speed, which was mentioned. And I think speed, whether it is possible or not, but it's not possible in the time which is needed. So we need other measures anyway. We need not only research to maybe be able to decouple to some extent or completely, but we also need some control measures, some changes of policies or of what is allowed or what is not. So.
Next question.
The next question, please.
So you have talked about how we could somehow reduce the amount of consumption by, for example, reducing luxury goods or so on. My issue with degrowth is that it mostly doesn't solve in itself the issue that we are in a limited resources Earth. We consume an amount of resources per year, independently of which system that we work on, either capitalist or any other system. So what do you think if we reduce, for example, the amount of resources that we consume per year to half, we will only be extending the problem twice as much, but it doesn't fundamentally change that. So you are asking for a fundamental society change just to prolong the amount of resources that we have on Earth, but it doesn't fundamentally solve that issue. And also on a second point, don't you believe that by reducing growth, it can also affect innovation on technology, sustainable technology? So, for example, if we have degrowth from the cities,
Yeah?
yeah,
I'm sorry.
if we have
Two of the
degrowth
members
from the
have to
cities,
leave. So, Logan, maybe you want to start?
Sorry, I can't, I have to read now.
Okay. Do you want to answer that question?
Should we collect, not like,
Michael?
everything?
Let me answer at least before she
I think
leaves.
she would
From the
my
way-
maybe it's like only 6 to 6, and if I make very fast, I'll get there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm living around. Thanks everyone, sorry.
Okay, can we have one last question from the audience and then like both of them can be answered together? We have 2 questions. Okay, I've got 3 questions. 2. Okay, 2 of you. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, at the beginning there was a statement, like Jesus said, that growth is driven by innovation and human capital, and then Anke said it is like because of more material consumption. And I think there is maybe a fundamental misunderstanding between these two sides, because I see like, yeah, both are true actually, I think personally both are true, but isn't the misunderstanding that like more innovation, human capital in the big picture leads always to more efficient extraction of resources and production and then wasting them. So that's my question, if you increase innovation, this will lead to more resource extraction, oil extraction, and this leads to more material consumption and then to the problems we have. That's my question to Jesus. And yeah, I would also like some debate to talk.
No, I get pretty much. My question is to Professor Schaffartzik. So do you think that degrowth should happen uniformly all over the world? Because if we look at the global north, they have experienced later stages of growth, and they have also contributed to more environmental degradation. So, and if your answer is no, then in the current global political system, how do you see it materializing?
So shall we start?
There was still one question there in the back. I think if we get it quickly, but it doesn't have to. Just want to discuss one person. Otherwise, we have not.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether you could paint a picture of what exactly the growth looks like, because there were some aspects that were touched upon, for example, restricting some fiscal constraints or maybe forgotten money along. But to me, as someone who is a bit of a skeptic, it sounds a bit scary. About it sounds a bit like I have to make sacrifices, which I mean, obviously I'll have to. But maybe if you could bridge the gap by painting a more exact picture of what life under the growth looks like.
Okay. Have the panelists record the questions? So we begin with the first one?
Try to start and try to remember best everything. I'm going to take the easy way out from the hardest question, which would take at least one whole course to talk about and elaborate. And I'm just would say a commercial for what I think are pretty useful books where very intelligent people have elaborated this question. So you have the Degrowth Strategy book put together by the Degrowth Vienna team, which tries to answer a lot of these questions for many, many different sectors: housing, healthcare, education, mobility, transport. You have a specific collection which is called Housing for Degrowth, edited by Anitra Nelson. You have Food for Degrowth, also edited by Anitra Nelson. You have a really nice collection of the Routledge Handbook for Degrowth, where more than 35 different author teams have put together solutions and tried to elaborate this as good as possible. And the good thing about these wonderfully written, elaborated texts is that they reference a lot of realities, not just imagined utopias, but concrete projects which could give you inspiration of what this might look like. Of course, the context is different, the location is different. To touch then on the, what is the benefit in all of this and how can we start to imagine it? Degrowth does have a lot of potentially troublesome phrases or ones that seem to make sense when we're talking together in an audience of academics, but maybe not so much in elsewhere. But I think frugal abundance is one that we can at least use to explore our own day-to-day patterns and the things that we do, both in what we do, how we use our intellectual capacity, how we use our physical capacity, how we spend our official state-issued currency, and how we spend our personal currency, which is our time, how we make relationships, and to try to use a different viewpoint to really decide what makes me happy, what type of usage of my physical and intellectual capacity makes me feel good and makes me feel more connected to the people around me, and how do I work to put myself in a position where I can concentrate on these more well-being-centered ways of living than just what we need to do to defend ourselves against each other financially, which is where the position a lot of us are left in, based on the system we have now. And about even if what we're doing, progress that we're making, doesn't have any point, well, at least in the field that I'm working closely, which is the field of agriculture, so increasing as much as possible knowledge of how to apply agroecology and regenerative organic agriculture in as many places as possible is giving us more hope and more time. So I don't see if tomorrow we don't have the interest in how to spread it globally. Well, we need to work to increase the knowledge so that we can save the living soil, the healthy soil that we have left, because if we don't do this work and we let industrial agriculture continue to chew up and spit out usable topsoil as it does and as it has done for the last 100 years, then we won't have any usable topsoil left within your and my lifetime. So there's this big question of how fast is the transition, but we can't let it cloud the good work and the things that we can achieve little by little as well.
As a quick advertisement, the book that you mentioned is public open access on Degrowth Vienna's website. So if anyone is interested in reading it, you don't need to pay for it. It's called Degrowth and Strategy.
Well, a lot has been said. I think the challenge is that we need to keep within our boundaries. As has been stated in the donut example or donut economy, we are living beyond our boundaries now. So the challenge is how to keep within. And I think innovation can help to some extent. But I think that your question actually was a tough one because, as we know, global north, you called it, versus global south, probably. There's some differences, and if we impose sort of degrowth on everyone, I think that this is a tough debate. And we have these debates on COP already, and there's no solution or only minor solutions there. So I think it's rather a question how to phrase or how to frame our economy differently within Western or global North countries, but also global South countries. And as we can see also from China, for example, yes, they already still invest into coal, but they invest to a large extent into renewables already. So I think changes and also attractive changes can be done in both sort of contexts.
Thank you very much for all of your questions. I want to try and say something about the first and the last question in conjunction because I think they're really related. And I'll start by very quickly acknowledging that for the longest time I did what a lot of people in interdisciplinary sustainability studies do, and all our articles in the conclusions by saying, there's a small window in which we can still change now, but if we don't, then destruction and crisis and war will ensue and we have to make changes now. And that is of course something that's written from an extremely rare, extremely privileged standpoint for myself as a scholar in the global north, as not already experiencing all of these things, crisis and war and the direct impacts of climate change on a daily basis, right? And sort of having the idea that this is still to come, or we're talking about now, if we don't change now, then this will happen. It's already happening. And I think that's sort of, for me, a little bit the point of, you know, what, even if we're limiting resources now, I think, especially given that these are not I mean, if we look at mass consumption and overconsumption in the wealthy segments in the global north, right? Then these are not resources that are keeping people alive. These are not resources, many of them actually, that are making people's lives significantly better. They're being consumed. Some of them are not even reaching consumers, right? We have plenty of products that are being produced and that are directly turned into waste without ever seeing a consumer. And so I think any little bit of whatever it is, resource that we can leave in the ground, right? If we can avoid expanding a mine, if we can avoid sending people into those labor conditions, any bit of fossil fuel that we can avoid emitting, it's not kind of, I'm not saying that will be the solution forever, but it can already make a difference now, and it can make a difference tomorrow and down the road. So I think sort of this, whatever we can do to either prolong the situation of not having crises and wars, or of ideally even saying, okay, we will not continue provoking wars for the sake, or actually engaging in outright war for the sake of access to resources, that would be worth something, right? And it would be worth something to the lives that are directly touched and affected by this. And I think that that's something that's hugely important. And I say this as someone who comes, you know, I came from the background of material flow accounting, where we can always say, well, you know, you might have your nice little suggestion for what we can improve here, but somewhere down the line there's a problem with that, and it's not going to solve the whole thing, right? Give me something that solves the whole thing. But I think if we can make people's lives a little bit, I don't even want to say easier, less terrible, then I think we're under an obligation to do so, especially for all of the reasons that you've stated, kind of for what the wealth and the comfort and the luxuries that we do have, for knowing what they're built on, right? And I think we have that obligation. And that, of course, means that degrowth cannot mean the same thing in the global north as in the global south, doesn't mean the same thing in the global east, doesn't mean the same thing in the very wealthy segments of the European population with European passports, as it does for people who are in Europe and don't have a European passport, right? It's a totally different situation. And with that being said, I think for this term of innovation, I completely agree with what's already been argued, that, you know, innovation isn't always good. It's something new, and something new we have seen plenty of times in the past can go either way. Sometimes it makes things better, sometimes it makes things a whole lot worse. But also, what do we recognize as innovation, right? Does it always have to be kind of a fancy new capital-intensive technology? Can innovation also be what Logan is outlining, for example, to kind of organize yourself in a community around sharing food and sharing means of transportation, and generally sharing in community of doing things together? That's innovative in our current system, right? And why don't we recognize that as innovation and as something that's worth supporting, also politically supporting? And I think that's something that
social innovation.
Yes, but then the question becomes, who is the we, right? And then who is recognized? Yeah, and I think with all due respect, and the Green Party has performed well in Vienna and in Austria recently, but it's not sort of, I think in the mainstream out, especially if we look at funding, that innovation still goes, money for innovation goes into technology.
Thank you. Very, very briefly, I just noted two questions. Actually, I believe one from behind there, and I want to talk something to the last one, who was asking for a definition of degrowth, if I understood it correctly. Does not, in my opinion, does not seem to have been given. So the first one, your point was, of course, very good. You could have, I mean, I think that you are talking between the lines about rebound effects. This idea that, a bit more than that, but also about rebound effects. Now, that's an excellent point. You are right that economic growth might, at least in the short to medium run, might actually lead to the opposite type of effect that you want to have, in the sense of innovation actually creating more resource use, I mean on the aggregate, but what innovation is famous for, and education and human capital, what they are famous for is for reducing resource efficiency. For improving resource efficiency, for reducing resource per unit of GDP or per unit of per head, per person. And that is the only thing that you can hope for in terms of getting to sustainability. Because there's this saying about you cannot have infinite growth in a finite planet. Well, I mean, sometimes math gives you a couple of surprises. I mean, you might know that you can have infinite positive numbers and still get a finite number, as long as these fall quickly enough, which is a beautiful metaphor of improvements in efficiency being strong enough as for you to be able to sum actually infinite positive numbers and get a finite end. And there, in the long run, it's only innovation. You are completely right. In the medium run, or the short and medium run, you could have those effects. That's why what Elisabeth was saying about the fact that you cannot have just one policy. You need to have a bundle of policies, and that's something that our department is actually working on. We've published already a couple of papers on which policies work for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in this case, and which bundles of policy work, because your statement was completely evidence-based in the sense that it's not one thing and not one thing all the time. That's my question, my answer to you. Now, on the degrowth thing, there has been no definition given of degrowth, and I did my homework. And I read, there's this great degrowth scholar, like one of the big guys, I don't know his second name, it's called Timothy something, this French. Thank you. So he published a paper, like last year, where it's called What is Degrowth, and it gives a definition. And it says, thank you. Like evidence-based politicians. I read from the abstract. This article analyzes 115 definitions of degrowth in English and French, ranging from 2006 to 2024. Okay, in 18 years, this guy, obviously top degrowth researcher, found 115 definitions of it, which goes hand in hand actually with also my experience when talking to people from the degrowth movement. In the beginning, I understood the degrowth movement, obviously wrong, about you need to stagnate GDP or bring it down just to work on the denominator so that the numerator can be the same. Obviously, that's when I thought I had understood it, they went like, no, that's not what it is about. It is about sufficiency. And then when I discussed about that, they were like, no, that's not what we mean. That has been my experience, and it fits very much to what the degrowth scholars say of their own discipline, if you want to put it like that. Do you want to know what their definition is, the meta definition that this guy found over these 115? Degrowth, and don't quote me on this, it's this paper. Degrowth is a downscaling of production and consumption. So there is indeed this to reduce ecological footprints, can make sense. Planned democratically, which I find a little bit like an oxymoron, but that's what it is. Planned democratically in a way that is equitable while securing well-being. Because that's kind of the common denominator of all these 115 definitions. I cannot, I mean, I was breathing out in relief in the sense that it's not a scientific theory. It is something different. So I'm fine. And that was very relieving for me. So that I hope that answers your question. And also maybe the question that some of you have.
All right, then that's the end of. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and thank you, speakers, for taking all the time. Really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure that the students have a lot to reflect on. We just have a small request, since this is part of our our self-learning project. We would like to make a selfie with all of you and the speakers. Yes. So maybe speakers can go here, and we'll take one with the photographer.